All right, so we're gonna keep going here with our snare and
Yep.
the reverb on there.
Reverb. So I've got it sounding pretty decent with EQ, so now I'm just going to throw some reverb on it. And I'm just going to dial it in slowly to taste. Okay, so we'll start with there. So I'm just going to leave it. So it's there, I hear it, I like what I hear. So now I'm going to go to the bottom.
Well, really quick, what are you trying to do? I mean, so when you put verb on the snare, I mean, that's something a lot of folks do, but is there anything specific you're listening for? Trying to make it huge, obviously. But
yeah, I want to make people jump up and down on their seats because the snare drum sounds so awesome.
Do you like the verb on your snare kind of dark or really bright? Or?
You know, I found that the darker the reverb, the more you can get away with before it starts sounding like, wow, they're using a lot of reverb. You just want the drums to sound big, not like, hey, did you hear the tail on his reverb? Like, it just needs to sound big, right? So, and especially in a live environment, if you just heard the drums by themselves in here, we're in a big room, so it already sounds like there's reverb. So we're just going to add some more of that and help it along. Some churches, you may not be in a big enough space where you have a big PA, and that even matters. Maybe you're not even micing the drums. So you just have to do what works for you. I will tend to use more reverb than people may think like, wow, that's a lot of reverb. But I think by the time we get to the end of the mix, again, I've got this picture in my head I'm going towards that hopefully we'll think it's good.
So in order to get kind of a darker reverb sound, do you EQ the effect return, or do you do it in the processing?
Yes, would be the answer. So maybe both. On the reverb here, there's a high-pass filter and a low-pass filter already built in. So these are really, 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 really important of how the reverb sounds. Now, on the CL, the way these come up on the default, I think is pretty stinking good. But with things like delay and maybe vocal verb, we'll tweak a little. If you wanted to, the low-pass filter is going to make that darker, and the high-pass filter is going to obviously make it brighter or take low end out, however you want to call that. Yeah. So EQing reverbs, it's a very good thing. You just have to be really careful with it. Okay, so top's good, so let's go to the bottom. As they loop around. We'll go back to the Here we go. He's back. Okay. So I'm going to do a lot to this guy, probably a scary amount, but.
So what are you using the bottom snare for? So the top snare is really a lot of your sound. You've already got some really crisp high end in there. You've got a lot of body in there. Are you using it more of like a utility sound?
Yeah, I think so. It's more of like just an accent. Like I want to hear the snares a little bit. So like the snare top sounds pretty good by itself. Like that would totally work. So this to me is just kind of icing on the snare drum cake. So I'm going to manipulate it quite a bit and do some compression stuff to really exaggerate the snare sounds and then just blend it in to taste. And again, cutting all that low stuff out because it's right beside the kick drum. So if you're not careful, it could turn into another kick mic. I'm going to go ahead and start compressing. And I'm going to get pretty severe here. And gain it up. And I'm going to go back to the EQ because now I've done so much compression, I'm really changing the way it sounds.
Yeah, so interesting with the compression there, you're really squashing it, which is part of the sound, which is what you want to do, but in that squashing and gaining it up so much, you're bringing up a lot of that noise floor, which is a lot of that, the snares kind of vibrating by themselves. Is that what you're hearing?
Yeah, it is, and I think that's okay. A lot of records you hear in the room sound, you hear a lot of that. I like it. But again, I'm using the compressor here to color the sound, not really to control dynamics. So compressor can be a great, a very black and white, let's control volume, or it can be another paintbrush in your art tools.
And I think it's good too that you mentioned that this is not the primary sound of the snare. We've got that with the other mic. This is very accent, very color, just to add in when necessary.
There's still a little high mid stuff I don't like. And I'll throw a little bit of verb on this too. Okay, so pretty good. And I'm going to turn the snare back up and then fade in the bottom. So here's without it, and with it. So it's just a little bit. It's just doing it just ever so slightly, but I like it.
And that method's also really great for when he starts doing ghost taps and things. You'll really hear the snares come out.
Yep, for sure. Okay, hi-hat. Now the way I've EQ'd the snare drum and on the overheads, there's going to be a lot of hi-hat. So I tend to not really overlook the hi-hat, but we'll see what happens. It can sound obnoxious also. Lots of mids there that I'm going to get rid of. All that. And I'm going to attenuate this down so that I can get my fader resolution back up. Okay, so about this time, I'll go back and turn kick, snare, and hat on together just to verify the blend, make sure there's nothing weird going on. And sometimes I'll throw the faders back down and then just re-blend it all pretty quickly. So I'm going to go back to the kick drum now and brighten it up a little. I think it's just a little too dark. Okay, now I'm going to move on to toms. So I like that. Now I'm going to go to the toms, and then we'll add the overheads. Do we have a section we can loop on the toms?
Yeah, we're going to go. We're going to loop the tom section right now. So we'll talk about how you're processing while I do that.
Okay, so I'm definitely going to gate the toms because they're so close to the cymbals. If you're not careful, no, not even if you're not careful, you will in fact get cymbals bleeding into the tom mics. I'm going to EQ them a bit first. We can already hear all those cymbals, right? So now I'll turn the gate on. And then I usually base the gate on the toms off the snare drum because the snare drum is going to be what opens it in most cases, unless your drummer is not like most drummers and doesn't hit the snare drum harder than anything else. But historically, drummers hit the snare drum pretty hard. So then I'll just start rolling this down. And I'll keep rolling it down until the snare drum or something else opens it. And now I'm going to turn the range up so that it's not completely closed all the time. So if you turn the range up, I found that when the cymbals do come in, it's not it's not like a big surprise out of nowhere. Like you hit the tom and then you hear the psh sound. So I leave them open about that volume.
So those toms sound really pretty big and huge. Do you guys tune them similar to the snare?
Yeah,
or?
yeah, very similar. It's finger tight and probably just a quarter turn. And that was intentional because we know what sound we're going for, what it's going to sound like with that microphone through the PA. So all that is ran through the filter of what is this instrument going to sound like in the house, not necessarily what it sounds like looking over the top of it. So now we'll add some verb. We'll use the same snare verb we used just to keep it simple. So the snare opened the gate there, so I'm going to crank it up one click. Okay, pretty good. Now I'm going to go to tom 2 and do the same process. Now I'm going to add some sub. Turn the gate on. And add reverb.
I think it's really important what you did there with the range and not completely killing the sound with that gate, but bringing that range up so that you don't get so much cymbal just splash in whenever that gate opens. That's a really critical thing about gating drums that a lot of guys, sometimes they'll overdo it and it just sounds kind of robotic.
It almost sounds like you only hear cymbals when the gate opens, even if they're mic'd or not. So here's the two toms together. And then I'll just blend the levels. Cool. And
how do you usually pan your toms? Do you do it by the drummer's perspective, from front of house perspective?
Oh, yeah, panning. That's a big topic. So when you listen to a record in headphones, you are in the stereo plane and you cannot get away from it, right? You can't pull one ear off and move one ear this way. When you're in a live environment, the only people or maybe person in a stereo environment are the people in the center aisle in the room where the two speakers are summing together the best. That maybe not even on the front row. So I try not to do really, really hard panning. I haven't done any yet, but if I did, it would just be like 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock. It's not very far, because if I'm sitting in the far left side of the room and I have tom 1 panned all the way to the right, they are never going to hear it. They may hear the reflection off the wall 200 milliseconds later, but they're not going to hear it. So same thing for guitars, all of that. I will tend to pan stereo instruments hard left and right, like keyboards, loops. If there's a guitar amp, I try not to, the left side is panned this way and the right side is panned this way, and both of those together make a great sound. I try to, if the left is going to be panned, it sounds good on its own, and the right sounds good on its own, and together in the middle, they also sound good. So it's really difficult to try and create a mix based upon the center of the room in the stereo field when 99.9% of the people in the room are not in the stereo field. If you're in a mono system, well then that's easy. We've made all the decisions for you. Yeah.
So panning is good, but keep it kind of mild if you're in an environment where it's a little bit more wide.
It can be great for getting things out of the way for the vocal, right? It can get really cloudy in the middle. So just moving things a little, 5%, 10% here, can make space for the vocal. It can be really good. But doing really severe panning, I think, is not a good idea live in most rooms. I'm sure there may be some situations, but. Okay, overheads. Now these are linked. Let's take a listen. Okay, so I'm going to definitely put a high pass filter on this. And cut out a lot of the mids again, all this.
Now, when you do your overheads, do you use them as more of just cymbal mics, or do you do a complete drum mic sound?
I like to do just cymbals, and we'll even position them that way because by doing big overhead mics, and this is an opinion coming at you real strong here, but to me, that's like a room mic, and the stage is loud, and why would you want to mic the stage? I read that way recently and thought, oh, that's a great way to put it. So even doing under mics or close miking the cymbals, I like a lot better because like you can hear in this, you can hear the guitar. There was no guitar amp on stage. So I think this reflection is just from the PA. So I'll cut loads and loads out of the low end and try and make it as close to just a cymbal mic as possible. You're going to get some attack from the toms, but we'll blend that back in and make sure everything's happening the way it should. I generally will maybe compress the overheads. I don't think it's necessary, but if I do, it's a really low ratio, and it's a really low reduction amount. Probably just 1 or 2 dB, so that if something loud happens, it's just going to catch it a little bit.
I notice you're pulling a lot of mid-range out of those cymbals. I assume that's to get some drums out. What other things do you do to keep them from those cymbals being nice and smooth and not being really harsh and brittle sounding?
The cymbals we use are darker than most, so maybe not ideal for recordings, but for live, again, every decision we make is based upon what it's going to sound like in the house, how all the microphones interact together live. So everything's really dark, and they're a little thinner than normal to keep the stage volume down. And sometimes we'll use a drum shield. Here, I don't think there's one on this, but sometimes we do. And it's not necessarily for the benefit of the front row or the house as much as it is to keep the cymbals out of a lead vocal mic, because we're using condenser microphones for vocals, and they're picking up everything on front, behind, sideways, everywhere. So darker cymbals for us are usually worked out better. Cool, so now I'm going to just throw all the faders down, and I'm going to reblend the drums at this point. Okay, I already want to add more low end on the snare drum, so I'm going to go back to this EQ for a bit. I want to use this guy. That's a little better. And throw up the others. Toms. And the overheads. Now I'm just going to listen. I'll check the gates on the toms. Seems to be okay. Okay.
So just listening to the mix here and observing the drum sound, it's a very huge, very wide sound. A lot of verb. It just sounds just really big. I know that's kind of the style of the song, but maybe this is a good time to kind of talk about. What do you think? I mean, when we're mixing, we're helping to create an environment here and to facilitate the experience. So. I mean, yeah, you're going for this particular drum sound because it's Trans-Siberian-esque and it's appropriate for the mix, but you're also trying to stir up emotion and create feeling.
Yeah.
So what are you doing there?
Yeah, I'm just trying to add energy to the room. So the band is sending all of that out to us. So I'm trying to not just take it and make it transparent, but almost add to it, so that when the people experience it, that they experience it to its fullest ability. A live performance, whether that's worship, whether that's a concert, I think you're trying to create an immersive experience. So my role is how can I translate what the band is doing and the experience that they're trying to create, translate that and emphasize, add to, and help create the best atmosphere possible for that to happen. So, it's, again, every decision in that final picture is based on what is going to help evoke emotion and energy and life into the room to help people worship the Creator, to help people understand the message that's coming from the stage. So all of that.
I think that's really good, and just kind of again bringing it back to the energy level. I mean, this is a very high energy song, But so these drums are very loud in the mix, and they're gonna be you're gonna feel it with the subs, and that snare is gonna be right in your face, but it's not offensive. You're mixing it in a way where it doesn't feel like it's just slicing my face in half. It's huge and full sounding, but I can still talk over it. We can still kind of think and concentrate. I mean, it's a really interesting. It's very, in a way, it's very dark. But at the same time, I'm not lacking anything.
Yeah, so I think that's intentional. I feel like if it's darker and punchier, you can actually get the SPL level a little hotter without it being offensive. And that's not to just drive up the dB meter for the sake of driving it up. It's to actually create an energetic feeling in the room. Now, you can do that with a lot of 4K and run people out of the room really, really quickly. But if you can mix around that and darker, fatter sounding, I feel like you can get, in my experience, even I've seen it, you can get higher energy level in the room because of the SPL level and it not be offensive by using that approach.
Yeah, I think that's really good. Talking about making it darker, and you use a lot of harmonics of the transients that are there in that instrument. So, like you said, 2K, 3K, 4K, those are all we know to be quite. Our hearing is very sensitive to those frequencies. So instead, you're using a lot of 8K, 9K, very sparkly stuff, which is not as offensive to us. We're still hearing the transient, but a lot of times it's a harmonic of it or octaves above it. But at the same time, we're also leaving room in that 2K, 4K area for vocals, for speech, where our consonants, our Ks, our Ss, and our Ts, where those are most pronounced. So when you eliminate that out of instruments, vocals have a lot easier time kind of fitting in on top.
Yep.
And it just makes the mixing job that much easier.
Correct. So another thing with drums is sometimes I'll run all of the drums to a group and then do a little bit of compression. You can do parallel compression. I've gone back and forth. Lately, I've just been sending them to a stereo group. Just a little bit of compression, help gluing them together, and then back to your two bus, your left, right, or whatever. So, but I would send all of those typically. I think, so we're sending them all to a group now. They're not being compressed, but sometimes, I think you can, but again, I would use a very low ratio and just a little bit of reduction. Not that you can actually hear it compressing, it's just a little bit of glue, and then that would be it. And then I would move on to instruments from there.
Do you associate the bass guitar? Do you try and marry that with the kick drum a lot, or I know they try and play together, but as a mix approach, do you try and do any voodoo with that?
Not necessarily. If I didn't know what the bass already sounded like, I would have consulted the bass when I was doing the kick drum. Since I know what it sounds like, I try just to keep them separate, whether that's the kick drum taking up the really low frequencies or the bass. Usually they do need to be separate or you won't really hear them at all. The bass here is going to be not on the super low, it's going to be more of the high lows, I guess, 100, 200, 300. It's going to live kind of in there. There's going to be information in the sub, but most of the tone and intonation from the bass is going to be higher in this situation, to where the kick drum, like you heard, is really pretty low. Yeah.
Awesome. Is there ever a situation where so you've got 2 kick mics, you've got 2 snare mics. When you're mixing on a Sunday morning, you're going to go from high energy service to more of a maybe slow, more intimate worship style.
Yes.
How do you change your mix there? Do you re-EQ? Do you just adjust faders? How do you approach that?
Most of the time, with kick drum specifically, since I have an inside and an outside, so you could also say I have an attack and a low frequency, I would maybe just turn down the attack microphone. If it was one mic, yeah, I would roll some of the high end off, and it immediately becomes less aggressive. Same thing with the snare drum. It's probably a little less high end. Now, he's probably not going to be hitting it as hard either, so those things are going to complement each other. If he's still hitting it that hard, and I'm expected to not make it sound aggressive, that doesn't work. So it's a definitely mutual decision there. He's not going to hit it as hard. I'm going to make some different decisions. And a lot of times, like you were talking about with loudness, it's just volume. So it could be just turn the fader down and it's not as bright anymore, just because of the way we hear high mid frequencies and that type of thing. So if you go from 100 dB down to 94, you could, in fact, just take the entire band mix down and it will appear to become darker because of the way we hear, and maybe it's not.
Yeah, I think that's so important to be able to actively mix and change the environment that you're in. I mean, our styles have changed so much. So the double miking on the kick drum, that actually does have some real purpose, like you said, just to kind of bring down the attack without having to go in and completely reconfigure things.
Yep.
Yeah, that's really good.
And you don't have to double mic a kick drum to get it to sound like that. It's just what we've decided to do. It works great. You can get somewhat that sound with just one microphone. And like we heard with the snare, we didn't have to have the bottom, but it's like icing on the snare cake.
Awesome. Well, that's great. So we just kind of went through a drum set and kind of EQ'd it and processed it and just did some really quick things and talked about compression. We're gonna take a quick break, and we're gonna come back and we're gonna talk a little bit more about instruments, and we'll get into mixing with loops and guitars and all these other things. So
cool.
We'll come back just in a minute.